Velasco. I am the Director of Curriculum and Assessment at the Ontario Teachers Federation. You're probably looking at my background thinking, what is going on? Why is this man in his car doing this webinar? So I work, the Ontario Teachers Federation office is downtown. And on my way up to be able to get to home, there was
Oh,
some
good.
issues on
Okay,
the
I'm
subway.
just.
So I am delayed. I was delayed getting home, and the only way I could start the webinar was to actually do it from my car. So I pulled over. I'm safe in a parking lot, but I apologize that this is where I'm having to deliver this webinar. It is not at all what I would have wanted or preferred. It is what we're doing, but thank you so much for your patience and your understanding with this. Um, we are delighted to begin our OTF Connects webinar series with this webinar. But as we begin, I just would like to read the Ontario Teachers Federation land acknowledgement. We acknowledge first and foremost that wherever you are in the province of Ontario, we are gathering and we live and play on the traditional territories of various Indigenous groups who have been present on this land known as Turtle Island since time immemorial. We acknowledge that this webinar, um, it, wherever we are on this land, has been meeting ground for Indigenous peoples for generations. We're grateful to the stewards and caretakers of this land. As advocates, teachers, and educators, we understand our collective responsibility to honor, protect, and sustain this land. We further recognize and honor within the membership of OTF those who are Indigenous to this land. This practice of recognizing the ancestral and traditional lands in which we work, live, and play is a concrete action that we undertake as a first step towards reconciliation between Canadians and the Indigenous peoples of this land. But it is not our only step. Collectively and individually, we must seek to denounce the injustices and wrongs that have been committed against the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and dedicate ourselves to cultivating and maintaining relationships based on mutual respect and truth. I certainly offer my thanks and my gratitude to the land and to the Indigenous communities and elders that have reached out their hands in friendship to me personally. I'm grateful for the sharing of their wisdom, especially when it comes to learning from the land and our relations with the land. So those of you who are joining, I want to apologize for where I am right now in co-hosting this webinar. You will see very clearly that I'm in my car in a parking lot. I had made plans to go home and deliver this webinar or co-host this webinar from home, and there were issues on the subway, which then delayed me getting to my car in time to drive home. So pulled over safely to a parking lot, and I'm hosting from here. So my apologies. The again is not the way that I at all wanted this to go, but I appreciate your understanding and patience with yeah, what has kind of unfolded for us on our end. I wanted to take a moment to introduce you to our my co-host rather for this webinar. I'm having a hard time being able to find Shafiq. I don't know where you went.
I'm over here, Moses. I
There
picked
you
up
are. There you
one of
are.
many of our little videos that are on.
There we go. Okay, I see you. So, everyone, Shafiq is from Harmony Movement. He's the director of programs with Harmony Movement. He empowers teachers, support staff, administrators, and leaders to enhance their skills in fostering inclusive learning environments. He has a passion for facilitating transformative conversations and connecting educators across schools and the province, creating collaborative structures to advance. Oh, sorry. Where did I go? Oh, to advance vital initiatives. Shafiq is also a high school teacher, supporting students with diverse special education needs in an alternative school setting in Toronto. He holds a BA in Equity Studies and Women and Gender Studies, along with a B.Ed from the University of Toronto. So, Shafiq, thank you so much for joining us. So that you know, I believe you all would have seen that there was a warning, not warning, but a notification that this webinar is being recorded. And so if you're welcome to keep your cameras on. If you don't want to be recorded, you can turn that off. That is fine. But what we thought we would do this afternoon is that Shafiq and I could have a conversation, a little bit about his work and some upcoming campaigns that Harmony is leading as we think about how do we identify and address harmful language in our schools. So, Shafiq, welcome.
Thank you so much, Moses. Really
Yeah.
appreciate you making the time for us here to connect, and really happy to see everybody here joining our call. Definitely have a number of your names that are familiar to me, so a pleasure to meet new folks and see some folks that have already been familiar with in the past. I also just wanted to share that I'm joining this call from the city of Takaranto, also known as Toronto. These are the traditional territories of many different nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. And of course, there's so many different indigenous nations that exist in this city and around this region. One thing that I always like to point to, and it's a resource that I'm sure many of us are quite familiar with, is native-land.ca. It's a website that continues to evolve, and I really love how they've made some updates in the last few years in particular. If you're not familiar, I just put it into the chat there. But one thing that I wanted to draw our attention to, just as a starting point for our conversation, is just to think about what we're seeing here on this map. It might be one that we've seen quite a few times, but of course, we're seeing here the region that we refer to as North America, also known as Turtle Island. And I always love to point to this image from nativeland.ca, just to think about the vast diversity of indigenous nations that exist on this land that we are on. So I think it's so critical for us to do land acknowledgement, but also, hopefully we'll be able to reflect and engage in that conversation today whenever we're talking about equity and inclusion and diversity, that we recognize that diversity is nothing new. It has always existed on these lands, and we've always seen a number of different nations, cultures, folks from different language groups and spiritual backgrounds and otherwise. That diversity has always been here. So just something to kind of point to and to recognize as we engage in our conversations today. But yeah, thanks for having me, Moses.
Pleasure. Thank you. So, Shafiq, I was wondering if we could begin our conversation here with you telling us a little bit about Harmony Movement. It may be about its history and how its work with schools has evolved over time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm happy to say that we're actually celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And if anybody wants to come out to the celebration, it's November 21st, just kind of plugging that. But, Harmony Movement's been around since 1994. We actually started out the organization's work doing community barbecues out in the park in the city of Toronto. And at that time, kind of just thinking about how we addressed the dynamic of like us versus them that was really present in communities, especially with increasing rates of diverse populations coming to us from many different countries from around the world. And so basically that's kind of Harmony's roots, our initial starting point. And since then, of course, there's been a lot of evolution for the organization. We do work with communities of schools all across Ontario and throughout Canada. One of the things that I'd like to mention is that for the last 3 and a bit years, so 3.5 years or so, we've created something called our Inclusive Schools Action Network. So this is a really, really great opportunity, and I'm so grateful to have our network members made up of classroom teachers, administrators, support staff, and school board staff from all across Canada, mostly Ontario focused though, who have come together and recognizing their existing commitments to the work of equity and inclusion. So it's through the work of our network, and one of the things that we really try to do is be responsive to some of the issues and concerns that are brought up by our members, that we actually created something called our Words Matter campaign, which we'll get into in a little bit. But really, if anybody was interested in being able to contribute, be part of conversations, I think this is a really great space for folks to engage with the work of Harmony Movement, and also more importantly, to be able to connect with other educators who have committed to this work. So that's a little bit of that kind of overview of our organization and the work that we do.
Yeah, cool. I'm the idea of an inclusive schools action network is incredibly practical, right? I know certainly working in schools when as a teacher, sometimes you can be doing work and any kind of work really. And it can feel kind of isolating if you're kind of at the front end of that work in your school. So knowing that there is an opportunity to connect with others who might be in a similar situation, I think is that's incredibly helpful. I'm glad to know that there's that kind of learning opportunity and support for people who are engaged in this work. It all, maybe a related question here is, I'm certain that in the network, through the network, and maybe that's kind of why the network was produced, but what are some of, based on your experiences, some of the most persistent challenges that we face in creating and maintaining safe and inclusive school and classroom cultures?
So one of the cornerstones of the work that we do whenever we go into schools and we have the opportunity to have conversations with students, with educators, and with parents and caregivers as well, um, is having a foundation where we have a sense of building community. And that's actually why we created the network in the first place, is because so many of us, although we have many colleagues, some of us are in really, really big schools. I actually happen to work in really small schools with only a few staff members. But regardless of the size of our staff at our school, a lot of people have expressed to me and to some of my colleagues that they feel kind of isolated, right? That they feel that they're working on their own, or that they don't have a lot of support or folks that they can rely on within their school. So, hearing that many times over the years, and I had this amazing opportunity to work with educators across the province. I felt, hey, how is it that we feel so isolated when there's so many of us working towards similar kind of goals? So that's why we created the network, to kind of address that challenge and to be able to provide that basis where we can support and empower each other. Whether that just means that, we have a place where folks can, listen and share their experiences and challenges of what's happening in the classroom, or to be able to collaborate and to collectively scheme together on what are kinds of actions that we could take in all of our places. So I'd say a persistent challenge is that sense of community building that isn't necessarily where I'd love to see it be in our school communities. And that's something that I think is reflected at the level of educators and school staff. But unfortunately, I'm also seeing that there are some of those trends amongst students as well.
Mhm. Can you tell us about some of the existing cultures that people in the network or that you are seeing in schools that are kind of being people are wanting to kind of unpack and recreate? Like, what is it we're moving from culturally in our schools towards and to?
Well, one of the things that I feel like we have to be very conscious of and be very deliberate in our actions is just considering the last few years or couple years since we've returned from the period of like virtual learning back into the classroom. And so some of the trends that I'm noticing that are pretty surprising actually come from my observations of, thinking about how students aren't necessarily connected to each other as much as they used to be, right? And I know that there's folks from multiple different generations here on our call today, but one thing that I feel like may be in common when we were all students in high school and earlier, um, we knew each other's names, right? And that's like a strange trend that I've observed, at least at the high school level where I teach, where you can have students who are in the same class or even have multiple classes together, have been together for months or even within a school year, and sometimes they just don't remember each other's names. And so that's kind of
Hmm.
something alarming, right? Like, how are you going to have a community when you don't even know who the members of that community are? So I feel
Right,
like,
right.
that's something that points to an understanding where, because of some of the trends and influences that came up during the period of virtual learning, and when we returned to the classroom, we didn't necessarily dedicate a lot of time to undo some of those ways in which students became more siloed, more than ever before, right? So I think these cliques have kind of gotten smaller. I think students, like, they know each other, they know of each other, but a lot of those interactions are now mediated through social media, And I think
Mhm.
that's a very passive way for folks to be able to connect and to relate to each other. So I definitely think that community building is a very, very critical step that we need to be intentional about. And even though we're still a couple years removed now and have been back in the classroom, I still think it's a issue that we should be very conscious of addressing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't remember who I was speaking with, but I don't know if they were citing research, but they were talking about um, us having to reconcile the impact of um, the pandemic and what it did to our not only our students' academic learning, but also their social learning. And that it's going to be a while before we really understand the fullest impact of that. Of those experiences with the pandemic, in particular, having to move into learning online, and teachers faced with the challenge of beginning school years online, and if a teacher was accustomed to building a sense of community, as you've indicated, that come easily meeting in person. um Students have missing out on that opportunity, and we're kind of feeling the impact of that now. So much so, as you suggested, we're at a place now where you've noticed in particular in secondary schools that students may have multiple classes with each other, and they don't know each other's names. And I imagine that perpetuates a particular type of culture in which there's no it, I guess, is it fair to say, interest in even getting to know one another? And what may happen then is a sense of distancing and lack of connection from each other, which kind of takes me to this campaign that you mentioned about earlier. It's called the Words Matter campaign. What does the Words Matter campaign aim to do? Maybe you could connect it to what we've just been talking about in terms of recreating some cultures in or yeah, yeah, re not yeah re I guess reshaping cultures in our schools. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Words campaign and Matter campaign rather, and how that those connect?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be able to share some materials with folks here on this call,
Hmm.
as well as some links that you can access some more information. But just to kind of pull back to the idea of that sense of a lack of community within our classrooms, right? Is
Mm,
there even an interest from students to know each other's names and to have those connections? I believe that there absolutely is. But we have to create those structures and engage them in that process of being able to like know each other's names and recognize each other. And obviously, just knowing a name is such a surface level thing. But I'm just kind of
hmm.
pointing an example of how far gone that process has been in the last few years. So we got to start off with that, right? And I think that that's why I do certain things where I use time every week in
Mm,
my classroom as a practice where I play games with my students, right? And obviously they love it because it's like students and they want to play games anyways. But kind of
mm,
incorporating that as a piece that I intentionally do. It's not a time waster. I'm not just trying to get through the day and have it be over with. I do spend that time specifically to make sure that we're playing with each other. We're having those interactions. It's mediated through some a process that usually is less pressure and less intimidation because there's not a specific assessment or a mark attached to it, right? Like the point is to like just have fun and play around. Um, and when we do create those connections, I mean, sometimes I play those games, especially early on when the students don't know each other and they say, maybe there's a game where you have to like point to somebody or call a person out and they'll say, oh, the kid with the red shirt or so and so with the baseball cap. And I'm always like, what? Who? Like, I don't let them get away with that, and I always make a point of saying, like, how do you folks need to know each other and to get to understand each other a little bit better. I find that it's always best facilitated through like a low pressure environment where they're kind of encouraged to have a little bit of fun with that piece. So the reason why I pointed to that as a starting point of our conversation is because, when we see the use of harmful and discriminatory language in our school communities, and unfortunately, it is reflective of the ways in which online interactions are kind of catered towards, really disregarding people, in a lot of ways dehumanizing people and being quite disrespectful, just for more engagement, more likes, to take a supposedly humorous approach to something, but really we're just kind of being dismissive of that person's identity or things that are important to them. So when we think about those influences, right, and this is what I'm saying in terms of being intentional about reshaping that culture within the classroom, we have to think about how much time our students are spending in those online spaces, communicating with each other in those formats, and how much that's carrying itself back into the classroom. So I
Hmm.
know I'm speaking to folks that are educators from K to 12. I will be using examples from teenagers, but there are a lot of young children who are interacting with each other, maybe not necessarily through Instagram. I was going to say Facebook, that's an old example, right? But they will be gaming with each other, for example, Minecraft or Roblox or Fortnite or these other ones, right? So those online gaming lobbies and how they talk to each other and the types of language that they use, right? If that's something that they spend as many hours doing every single day as they are in the classroom, or sometimes potentially even more, right? You can imagine a student gets home around 4 o'clock, and if they're gaming all night long, that's a lot of time that can kind of shapes how they think about interacting with their classmates. So coming back to your question about the Words Matter campaign,
Mm.
this comes out of the work of the Inclusive Schools Action Network. And I think one thing that might resonate with pretty much everybody on this call here today is, we've seen a huge spike in the use of harmful and discriminatory language, the kind of identity-based bullying that, unfortunately has been around for forever. But there's been a real spike in the number of incidents all across Ontario. And this is something that I'm noticing both through some surveying that we did, and we gathered a little bit of data, and I'd be happy to share that in a second. But also the types of calls that I'm getting from educators, from administrators, asking us as Harmony Movement to come in and support them in addressing this issue within their school community.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. Would you do you have that data accessible? Could you is that
Yeah,
something
for
you could share
sure.
with?
So let me pull up this stat that I have here from
Yeah.
a survey we did with our network members.
Well, while you do that, I am thinking a little bit about I'm thinking more about what you shared there in terms of um, the online spaces that that our students are engaged in. How does that what impact does that have in in-person interactions, right? And so that disconnect that can, like, how it's easier to kind of, yeah, be more cruel to people in when you write them, when you send them a message, then you wouldn't say these things in person if they're sitting right in front of you or standing right in front
Mhm.
of you. But online there's like this, I don't know, this protection almost that people have. And so you're I'm just thinking about that reality, and if our students are spending a lot of time in those kinds of spaces where the person is just a name, that's all they are, right? Or a handle. They aren't really, they don't there's nothing real about them other than just this thing that could be a chat bot, right? For all they know. And so that feeding then this in-person culture of dehumanization and yeah, and just being opening yourself up even to using more discriminatory and harmful language, right? Because of
Yeah.
that dehumanization. Anyways, but yeah, so you've got some stats that can kind of describe what you're talking about.
Yeah, so these are just a few stats that we have here from our network members. So it's a small sample size, but it is indicative of, I guess, some of the trends that we're starting to observe in terms of the types of discriminatory language that are used. Oftentimes, obviously, this is different for each school community. It's a lot of language based on race or skin color or cultural background. We also have a lot of harmful language directed towards to us LGBTQ plus students. So thinking about sexual orientation and gender expression. Um, and you know what? This is something that, obviously is not completely separated from the kinds of conversations that we're seeing more broadly in our society, right? So obviously if we're getting our young kids in a space where any person from any age group or from any location in the world can interact with each other, right? These influences are definitely reflective of the broader types of conversations that we see online. And to think about, how important it is in terms of how how difficult or easy it might be to dismiss somebody and their feelings and emotions and the impact of your words on them based on how well or how little you know them. Let's say, for example, this was a meeting in person and all
Mm.
30 something of us were together in one space, face to face, right? Obviously, that increases our level of interaction. We can kind of read each other's body language a little bit more. That social emotional intelligence piece is at its peak, right? Um, and if we know each other by name, if we know a little bit about that person, right, and their background, their interests, things that are important to them. I mean, these are all things that develop our relationships and make it harder for us to kind of write a person off and to dismiss them really quickly and easily, right? Now, even thinking about virtual interactions, right? You and I, Moses, we have our names here. We have our cameras on so you can see our faces, you can hear our voices, right? So that's a layer of interaction and recognizing that I'm a human being, right? And like seeing who I am. Now let's think about, turning off our cameras, right? I'm
Mhm.
sure our audience all of a sudden will have a little slightly dampened connection with what we're saying or how they relate to it. Now, let's say we didn't even have our names and we're just a couple of voices speaking, right? Once again, level of connections lowered. Now, let's take that to just text. And let's even not even have our names, but also have like random usernames that are there, right? So I'm just kind of painting that picture to
Yeah.
show, right? Like if most interactions are in that type of format where you don't see that person's face, you don't know who they are, it's not even a real name attached to the comments or things that they're posting. I mean, why would you care? Right? They're
Right.
not a real
Right.
person to you. So if we're kind of taking those frameworks and that's the place in which we're normally interacting and we kind of forget that okay, I'm actually in a school with real people and like these are my classmates and they matter and they live in my same community or we're connected in different ways. We have to remember that, right? Because this is why I think that we're seeing the types of stats that we have here up on the screen. So I'll just read out a couple of them just to folks, it would be helpful for them to have them read out.
Hmm.
So we've seen, and this is over the last school year, there's 40% as a reported increase of daily incidents, daily of harmful and discriminatory language in their schools, right? And that's something that we have to consider, right? Every single day. Like that is significant as a marker. We see here 58% of youth say they have seen kids insulted, bullied, or excluded based on their race or ethnicity at school. Another stat, for example, 48% of students are hearing slurs daily, and 37% of trans students are verbally harassed daily or weekly about how they express their gender or their pronouns or their name and other instances. And so like, these are stats that we should all be alarmed about. And if
Hmm.
we talk to our students and ask them these questions, once again, drawing from my experience at a high school level, a lot of students say like we hear this for the second that we put our foot in through that door and walk into the school, right? It's like
Right. Wow.
that's the beginning of their day. So this is a
Mm.
very prevalent issue for us to consider. So when we think about the Words Matter campaign, to kind of spell it out in the simplest terms, these are the issues that we want to address. So the purpose of this campaign specifically is to provide educators, administrators, and school board staff with some additional tools and to kind of hone in those skills that they could use to effectively intervene and address discriminatory language every time they hear it coming up. Now, that's not a simple task. I know that we already have a lot on our plates. Sometimes at the
Mhm.
end of the day, I like kind of zapped my energy and I don't even have children to take care of. I just have to think about myself, but yet, it's still quite a lot. But we're really trying to think about how we can have consistent intervention as the key strategy towards shifting these types of stats that we saw, and to be able to send a message to all of our students to parents and caregivers, to the broader school community, that this is a particular commitment that we are going to be unwavering in our application. The other piece is to empower educators and staff to intervene. So we have a number of different scenarios and examples. We have a framework of how to intervene. Now, having said that, I recognize, we kind of always do this anyways, right? We have our own classroom management strategies. We have our own ways of being able to intervene. So there's a lot of really solid work and really, really positive strategies that educators already use. But this is the kind of just weed out some of those challenges, identify some concerns or things where we're not really sure about what we should say or how we could intervene in that moment, or it might feel awkward or tense to do so. So this is a way to be able to just kind of practice that piece. Um, Finally, we have to think about, collaborating amongst all people within the school board, sorry, the school community, and being able to measure and understand gaps in knowledge, policies, and practices related to harmful language use. So there's a lot of different things that you can access through the links that I will be sharing in a little bit. But the key thing is just to be able to get educators, students, as well as parents and caregivers intervening to start to shift this tide that we've been seeing.
Yeah, so the words matter campaign then sounds like a campaign intended to mobilize an entire school community to be able to identify and address discriminatory and harmful language, and that it's almost a consistent approach. Because you'd mentioned earlier, we all have our respective ways of addressing issues in our classroom, but it might not be consistent across the school in terms of how do we identify and address, in particular, harmful or discriminatory language. Especially, yeah, I hear you. So if a school then is interested in getting that kind of consistency across, the entire organization and throughout the community, then the words campaign matter sounds like Words Matter campaign rather sounds like a great thing to get engaged with. Um, I'm wondering, Shafiq, how might a school leader or a classroom teacher or a community parent know that the Words Matter campaign is for their school community? Is there kind of some questions. I mean, like you shared those stats, right, of what students and teachers were reporting about language, but is there questions that teachers or school leaders or community parents could ask students to kind of get a sense of how widespread this issue is, and the issue being using discriminatory or harmful language?
Absolutely. Now, I will say this. I hope there are school communities out there where this campaign is completely irrelevant for them, that they just don't
Mhm.
need these tools.
Sure.
Unfortunately, I think that it's becoming such a prevalent issue in pretty much any type of school community, not just in, the larger urban centers, but
Mm.
all across. So I would say some things for you to consider is just thinking about the frequency in which harmful and discriminatory language shows up in the classroom and throughout the school community. One of the things that is a very important conversation for us to consider right now is immediately outside of the GTA and outside
Mhm.
of this urban core. Because of various factors, for example, price of housing, cost of living, all these financial considerations that make it really, really hard for families to be able to survive right now in this economy. Many are moving further and further outside of those traditional urban centers that we would normally kind of see very, very distinct cultural diversity. And so with that is coming with its own unique challenges right now. So what we're actually seeing is that about, in a radius of 1 to 2 hours outside of downtown Toronto, or
Mhm.
so the city of Toronto, 1 to 2 hours outside of it is where we're seeing the highest frequency and increase in the use of harmful and discriminatory language, where there's just like a lot of hate speech that's being used. I think that, as communities are entering into these spaces in which, the demographics might have looked pretty similar over the last like 50, 60, 70 plus years. Now all of
Mhm.
a sudden there's new families from new places in the world that are joining there, and folks are trying to figure their way through it. But those issues are showing up as like little mini battles inside of our classrooms. So just to consider your demographics of your school. right? And not just to think about cultural diversity, but also sexual orientation diversity, gender diversity, language diversity, religious diversity, ability diversity. I mean, as we're striving to be more equitable and inclusive in our practices, we're also creating spaces for students to be able to express their identities and to have that recognized and valued within the school space, which is extremely important and very, very positive. And you know, we're making really big shifts as a result of doing that as educators. But you know, it's something that we have to be mindful of as we are more open and expressive of our identities. That kind of also provides grounds for folks to focus on those identities and to bully each other. Now, I know this issue happens. Not only amongst our students, there are issues that come up in terms of how staff experience these issues. You know, we've been recording some stories and documenting the kinds of incidents that happen within schools. And, you know, a recent story a colleague of mine shared with us was how a teacher candidate who's Black, you know, was in the playground at an elementary school, and a grade 5 student would be making whipping noises at her, right? As a young Black woman, she's having a child interact with her in this way, right? And so, you know, obviously our staff are also affected as well, right? And we want to think about that's a very important piece. Our parents and caregivers, right? They could be on the receiving end. Sometimes they might not be as open and inclusive to the you know, new diversity that we're seeing within all of our communities. So this affects everybody, right? So if we want to just take a note of those types of issues and incidents that happen, if an administrator were to have seen a rise in the number of issues that they have to go through their reporting mechanisms, and you know, maybe there's aspects of formal discipline that have increased over the last couple of years, I think that's something that indicates this as well. There's a really, really great article by uh, Carla Dangana Sainju from the OSSTF Education Forum.
Mhm.
And I'll share the link in just a second, but the source is down there. So I just wanted to draw our attention to a few of the statistics that she gathered from surveying OSSTF member educators. So what we see here in this first table is the frequency of teachers witnessing identity-based bullying. So, you know, very similar to the what we've been talking about in terms of harmful language. So obviously we see the huge, prevalence of a few times a year, right? But, you know,
Mhm.
it is something for us to consider once or twice a month, right? When we look at the gray bar to the right, 23, 23, 24, 25, and once or twice a week, right? So if you think about it, although that might not necessarily be the highest percentage represented on this table, those are of a much greater frequency, right? So how
Right.
often we see this happening in the classroom is actually very, very, it's been very, very present, right? So that's something for us to think about. You know, maybe you want to use some existing information from your school. If there was like a school climate survey that was instituted, maybe there's something specific in your school improvement plan goals for the school year, or just generally and anecdotally, you've been noticing that there's a lot of these more contentious issues that have been coming up with people's experiences, then I think that the campaign would be of support.
Well, it's interesting. Like it is one thing for teachers to witness these things. It is a different thing to be the victim or the recipient of, or being the target of discriminatory or harmful language, right? So whether the frequency is a bit is shocking. Those gray bars, the three on the right.
Mhm.
But just thinking about that's just what we see and what we hear. It likely is an indicator of it even happening more regularly than what we actually witness. Um, so with that in mind, like, are there questions that that we could pose to students um, yeah, that we might be able to get a sense or a handle of um, what what students are experiencing?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, one of the introductory activities that we have in some of our student presentations is just asking students, raise your hand if you've heard, you know, harmful language being used this school year. Raise your hand if you've heard it this month, this week,
Mm,
today, right? And you'll start to kind of gauge, how often and how frequent this issue pops up within your classroom, right? So there's these kinds of very, very simple questions that we could ask our students as a starting point to engage in those conversations. Um, but I think that a really, really good place for us to think about beginning before we even engage our students is
mm,
to engage ourselves and our colleagues, right? So these would be
mm,
questions that we would pose to educators and everybody that's on our call here today. I invite you, if there are any um, contributions that you'd like to put into the chat based on these three questions, please feel free to do so, and we'd love to respond to them. So the first question is, do you speak up every time you hear harmful and discriminatory language? Right? And why or why not? Question number two is, what are the barriers or hesitations that would prevent you from intervening every time? And finally, question three is, how do your own social identities impact when and how you intervene? So, one of the things that comes up really, really often for us, and it's definitely an issue that we're going to be monitoring quite closely throughout the campaign's timeline, is that educators are nervous. They're kind of fearful of being reprimanded, of saying the wrong thing, of trying to intervene and to ensure a positive, inclusive school climate, but perhaps ending up using incorrect language or terminology and offending somebody, right? And that is definitely a consideration for us to have. I think we all, at different times can say the wrong thing or be well intentioned, but the impact isn't the same as our intention. Um, but I think that that's such a huge issue that comes up so regularly, so often, that we should take that on as like one of our key responsibilities as a starting point. So first and foremost, I always love to share, and every time I'm doing training with fellow educators, just to be able to create an environment in which we can ask questions, right? Like, is it okay to say this? Like, it just usually takes a few seconds just to like give that person the green light or let them know like, yeah, that's totally fine, right? A lot of educators, for example, are fearful to even use the term black or brown when referring to students who use those terms to refer to themselves, right? And so these kinds of hesitations, I think, are important in one sense, where we're being mindful and we're being critical, right? And we're making sure we don't just put our foot in our mouth and forget about it. But at the same time, right, if we keep on getting caught up into that loop of I'm not sure what to say, so maybe I won't say it, and I don't want to get in trouble here, so maybe I won't intervene. Obviously, the impact is always going to fall onto our students' shoulders, right? So I think that's something that's really, really critical for us to consider as a starting point for our conversation. And also, do we speak of every time we hear harmful and discriminatory language? I know it's been a few years, Moses, since you've been inside of a classroom specifically, but
mhm.
how about you? I mean, like thinking about your own experiences, was that something that was very present for you in consistent intervention of harmful language?
Yeah, so and sometimes, admittedly, when I would hear it, I mean, my background is I was an elementary school teacher, right? I was a classroom teacher for 10 years. I did everything from kindergarten to grades 4 to 8 and some special education in there. But one of the things that was always like when I would hear like harmful language, I'd always kind of stop and be like, okay, so where is this coming from? Like, what's the context of this? Because sometimes I noticed that I had students that would use words and they thought they were using it in a particular way or it had a particular meaning and it was not quite right. So I found myself needing to do a little bit of digging with elementary students. So like, what word is that, and what do you think it means,
Mm,
and what are you trying to communicate here? Because sometimes, I mean, and then as a student myself, I typically heard this kind of discriminatory language and harmful language when there was conflict, right?
yes.
So that wasn't always the context in which I heard elementary students using it, though. Sometimes it would be where, in particular, it was around sexual orientation more than anything. Um, and I didn't hear as much race-based language, harmful language, mostly around sexual orientation, and so could be characterized as homophobia. but yeah, just but I really did have to kind of step in and dig a little bit, and then and talk to the kids about what is it you're trying to communicate here, and what's alternative language that we can get in. But sometimes if I was in the schoolyard during recess, I might hear something in passing, and I'm like, did I really hear that? Is that really what I heard? And then you kind of you look at like the kids that are having the interaction, and then you decide, okay, this doesn't look like it's escalating. Maybe it's fine. And and there are other times where, admittedly, if I'm going to be really honest, and admitting it very publicly, I don't know that I prioritize that, like to stop it right away. So if I didn't see a immediate threat to anyone's physical well-being, if I was busy or I needed to go somewhere, I might be less inclined to interrupt it, because it's like, okay, well, it's not going anywhere, right? It got used and it's just words. So, yeah, to like looking at that first question, that's actually what I was thinking about. I don't know that I spoke up every time I heard it. There were lots of other things going on for me, and you know, yeah. But I think that's how I would answer that question.
I mean, I imagine that the folks that are even on this call right now, or who will be viewing the recording later, like we're all kind of a little bit maybe keeners, right? Like we're pursuing some additional education. We're interested in these things, and so it's definitely a big assumption. But I would assume that many of us here are interested in making those interventions and engaging in those strategies, right? And one
Right.
thing that your story just brought to mind for me is that no one teacher can do it alone. Like I think
Mhm.
that's such a critical piece, right? And
Right.
that was an experience that I had in the alternative school that I was teaching in last year, where it's me and two other colleagues, and our
Mhm.
administrator, because it's an alternative school, is not on site. So we had a few different supply principals. Our VP wasn't on site more than one day a week at most. We had a CYW from the previous year that was cut. We had an EA from the previous year that was also cut, so no support staff. As me and two other teachers, and two of the other teachers were on extended medical leaves at that time. Now, basically, like I kind of felt like I was a bit on my own there because everybody else was a bit transient and coming in and out. And the connections with students that I had, like it was great. I had really, really good relationships, but I could not, no matter how much I put in, no matter how often I tried, I couldn't do it by myself, right? So this is exactly where we're coming to. The purpose of the campaign is to be able to encourage as many educators as possible to be able to take this on as a part of our responsibilities. Now, of course, there's a lot of reasons why we should be responsible for this issue. I mean, we can go to thinking about responsibilities of our profession, certain policies that are in place from the provincial level down to our school board and schools in particular. But I think more than just thinking about like those policies and professional responsibilities, we see it in the lives and impact on our students on a day-to-day basis, right? And so if we're able to work as a collective and to truly take that up as a whole school responsibility, then that makes everybody's jobs easier, but more importantly, it makes that impact for that student much more palpable, right? So, many of us that might be on the call here today might take this as a really serious thing, and we like consistently intervene and do our best as much as we possibly can. But let's say that student is on the other end of the school, right? Like you're not there. You can't
Right.
you can't make that intervention if you're not there. And so that's why we need as many hands on deck. Another stat here. Sorry, let me just make sure I'm going to the correct figure. Yeah, so this is another very interesting stat from Dr. Sanju's article, uh, talking about the reasons why teachers would respond to identity-based bullying, right? And as we can see here, first I'll highlight, if we look at um, a couple of the ones that are lower down on the right-hand side of each one of those columns, following policies, right? It's one of the lowest responded to reasons for why they would intervene. Now, I'm not saying we don't need policy. I mean, like those things are important,
Yeah.
but if we look at the values and sense of responsibility, prior experience and knowledge, to develop student moral engagement and awareness against bullying, and to support students and reduce the short and long-term impacts of bullying. Those are way up there, right? And so if
Mm-hmm.
we think about always centering the conversations and ideas back to our students, I mean, like I said, I recognize like sometimes we're really, really trained or having a really long day, but I often find that when I kind of click back into the empathy and compassion that I have for my student, like it's a little bit of like a separate gas tank that I have, right? It gives me that extra energy that I need just to be like, I have to say something, right? So I have a quick story that I like to share in terms of like the types of impact that can happen with consistent intervention. And while I'm sharing this story, I'd really love to hear from folks here on the call. I'm inviting you to answer any of these three questions, but specifically, I'd be really curious to hear more from folks on question number two there. What are the barriers or hesitations that you have that would prevent you from intervening when you hear harmful and discriminatory language? So if folks can please put their contributions into the chat, would love to hear that and to respond to some questions as well if you have any. So the story I want to share is from a couple years back, and this was a classroom of about 15 or so students. So it's not a really large classroom. It was a GLE classroom, learning strategies. And I had students with very diverse needs in terms of accommodations and learning styles and the types of supports that they best responded to. Now there were a couple of boys who had a lot of high energy, usually come in with like some sort of big bottle of juice or pop after lunch, and the effects. So they definitely love to play around quite a bit. They would get their work done, but it takes some coaxing sometimes. The environment within the classroom, though, was nice in the way that the students, they like to laugh, they like to play around with each other, they like to joke, but we know, of course, that sometimes goes in the wrong direction. So these two boys in particular, they would make good jokes, and but sometimes they would make bad jokes, right? They would focus on making fun of people's identity or appearance, and so there was definitely this issue where, like, in terms of the learning environment and what was conducive to students like enjoying their time there, but also making sure that we're getting our work done. I didn't want to be too much of a disciplinarian or like overly strict, like nobody laugh, like that's ridiculous, right? So,
Right.
but I did want to create an environment in which we could do some of that, and have those interactions and be a little bit lighthearted. But there's a line that we need to draw, and these two boys in particular started to kind of pick on one other student who. Now, I didn't ask the student, he didn't share with me. I don't know what his sexual orientation is, but they were making homophobic jokes towards him, making fun of his appearance and the way that he dressed, calling him effeminate, making fun of his voice and saying it's too high pitched, and so on and so forth. And so for me, like I said, I wanted to create some space and opportunity for the students to be able to like laugh with each other and to lightly joke around here and there. But anytime it went into an issue of something like a homophobic comment or supposed joke that was being made, I'd like put my foot down. I'd like interrupt like whatever I was doing. I'd like stop mid-sentence and just like make it very clear, like that is not acceptable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, you can't just do that alone, and like that's not going to be a single strategy that's going to lead to the success that I want to see. But that was something that I wanted to just make clear to those two boys, to the other student who was on the receiving end, but also to the whole class, as something that is not acceptable, right? And to have that as a balance of creating that opportunity for joy and lighthearted behavior, but also distinguishing that this is not that, right? This is actually disrespecting a person, trying to cut them down in a way. So I'd put my foot down there. I'd intervene every single time. I'd let them know, and I'd make sure to be serious about that point. Now, obviously, the behavior didn't change immediately, right? That happened several different times, and I would intervene, and it kind of kept happening. So, of course, I would then take those two students in times where it made sense, um, either during the class or immediately afterwards, and pull them aside, right, and be like, "Hey, like what's going on here? Like, I know that we're trying to make jokes and talk, but I notice that this is the dynamic that's emerging within the classroom. And, like, I want us to think, like, how do you think that's making this person feel?"
Right.
So we had a few of those conversations, right? Like I said, it didn't work right away, but a few different times, I did have those interventions with those students. And it was after like the second or third conversation that, they kind of like were realizing, oh, our teacher here, he's not gonna give in, right? Like no matter how often
Mhm.
we do it, like he's gonna keep on going in this line. So I better kind of switch it up. And I started to see that that was starting to reflect in terms of how they would engage with the student, or instead of making
Mhm.
jokes, they just kind of wouldn't say too much in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Now that was over like more than a month. So it like took many different attempts, many different tries, but that was something that I thought was a positive example of how, when students are stuck to this point so consistently, and as educators, when we have so much on our plates and so many other things that we're taking care of, and so many students, right? Let's not forget cuts to education are leading to us having 30 to 35 or sometimes even more than that number of students in our classrooms. We don't always have the energy to be so consistent. But I noticed that in doing so, right, that was something that actually shifted it. But it took many, many attempts before I started to see the results that I wanted to see. Along the way, of course, I also, would check in with the student that was on the receiving end, just let him know that I'm here for him and to not push too much and get too deeply into the conversation. I kind of took his lead on it.
Mhm. 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 Interesting. There are a few people that have shared in the chat as Shafiq, so maybe you might want to take a look and see about people's experiences. But in generally, based on what I'm seeing people are sharing, is that one of the barriers to intervening might be that it's easier if it's actually perhaps an identity that you hold yourself. If the bullying is identity based and it's an identity that you share, might be easier to know how to react to that or respond to that versus when the hurtful or discriminatory language is based on an identity that you don't hold. That might be a barrier. Another barrier might be intersectional identities, right? So, and maybe that's related to the first, but when there's identity-based bullying, it might not be because of one identity that a student might hold. It might be multiple. So, how do I address all of them? If that's the case, I don't know. I'm not sure if the identity-based bullying would actually capture each of those identities, but certainly when there is students who hold multiple identities, that is something that's a consideration. The I think another barrier that's being identified here is just having knowledge and confidence that comes with that to address the language appropriately, right? It could be a barrier. Some people are writing a barrier. Could be that I don't want to say anything that might actually misinform the students of what actually is going on here. And so I want to know what the tools are and the knowledge that I really need to be able to handle the situation. Another challenge might be my actual position in the school. I might not be a permanent teacher in that school. I might be there on an occasional basis as an occasional teacher. And so that in doing that, then I don't necessarily have a relationship with the students that I can kind of fall back on in a way that you described, Shafiq, right? Where you like those students knew you, they knew what the lines were, if you will, that were problematic if they crossed, right? So just that our own positionality within the school could be a barrier. So I'm not sure if I wonder. Oh, sorry. Sorry, there's more here.
Yeah, there's
um,
there's a lot of really, really great comments in the chat, but let's
yeah.
let's
Oh,
pick
wow.
up those couple pieces first, Moses, because I
Okay.
think there's
Sure.
good depth there. Um,
Yeah.
First just thinking about, whether or not we share the identities of the students
Hmm.
that are experiencing this harmful language, and how our level of familiarity based on our own social identity impacts the ways in which we might intervene, right? Um,
Hmm.
You'd be really hard pressed. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you will be really hard pressed to find somebody who has like, if you think about that wheel of social identity with like race and gender and language and sexual orientation and place of birth and socioeconomic status, you'd be really hard pressed to find somebody that has every single aspect as like aspect of privilege that they enjoy, right? Like privileged identities, we might have many of them, but usually there's something that we've gone through, an experience that we've had in our own personal lives that we can connect to the struggles and issues that our students are going through. So I'd invite
Mm,
people, first of all, let's kind of demystify it a little bit, right? Like I'm not saying that there's no need to study or to learn or to listen to people's experiences if they have different identities than you. Of course, there's a lot of value to that. But to demystify it a little bit means to not think that my experience is so fundamentally disconnected and different from your experience, right? And
mm.
all the meowing here, my kitty's back home. He's joined the webinar too. Anyway,
Yeah,
so where was I? So thinking about starting with our own experiences
right.
and using that as an entry point to connect with the things that our students are going through, particularly when they
Mm,
have different identities than we do, right? The
mm,
other thing is, once again, with that collective approach, uh, so many of our staff bodies, have increasingly diverse we have increasingly diverse colleagues in our schools. I mean, there's a lot of catching up to do still, for sure. But we can go and ask a colleague, ask a friend, right? And say like, hey, I'm not sure how to talk about this thing, or there's this language that people are using, right? So just like asking our colleagues, asking our coworkers within our
mm,
schools to get that support and that perspective, right? No one person can know about every single issue or every single incident that might come up within a school environment, right? And I very much include myself in that, even though like I focus on equity and inclusion in education. I had the opportunity to go to school on those topics specifically. Like I still don't know everything. Of course, nobody does, right? So asking questions to our colleagues, being able to share, asking them how would they handle it, right? And maybe both of you are wrong, but like ask a third person. And usually you
right.
probably end up somewhere that hopefully will be able to support that student. I'm also seeing the
Mm,
very challenging as an OT. Oh my
yeah.
God, I know, like that's like the hardest thing. Like I remember there was one time I was in the school's cafeteria.
Mm,
Oh, Um, I might not be that old. I mean, I got a couple grays in my beard. I don't think I look like a student by any means, right? But
mm,
I some student was kind of being really, really rude to somebody else, right? It wasn't identity-based bullying, but they're kind of like just like leaning into somebody too hard. And so I intervened. I'm like, hey, like what's going on here? Like, let's not do that kind of thing. And the student turned to me like, who are you? Like, are you even a teacher here? Like, why are you
mm.
like, who are you to talk to me about this? And I was like, what?
Uh,
Really, like, like that's intimidating as a response, right? We were like, you don't even have a right to speak to me because like I don't recognize you. So like as an OT, listen, I hear you. It's so difficult. But you know what? I mean, like it just took me to say, like, it doesn't matter who I am, right? Like what I'm
mm,
seeing right here is not okay. And actually I'm a teacher that's here, even though you don't have a class with me. I am a teacher that's working in this school. So I'm gonna say something, right? So just have that
yeah.
persistence and that sense of confidence, although sometimes it could be really challenging what students say to us, especially as supply teachers. Like, I'm sure we've been through it quite a bit of us have been through that experience. You still kind of get past it, right? Like, don't let that dampen your ability to be able to intervene and as much as you possibly can, try not to be too phased by those quick
Mm,
ways the students might try to dismiss you, right? Because they're trying to get out of something, so
yes,
do it,
right.
right? They're gonna be like, doesn't matter who I am, right? Like this is something that
Mm,
needs to be addressed right now.
mm,
Yeah.
mm,
I'm also
mm,
seeing a really great question here from Pauline.
mm,
So I'm gonna just read it out because I think this is a really good area to focus on. So the question I have is the communication that is beyond words. Our small town, which was predominantly a white community, is shifting rapidly. So when I'm having conversations and teaching in my classroom as a history and civics teacher, what I've been noticing is the nonverbal communication between students. For example, a look, a nod, a super fast hand gesture. It gets tricky to know their intention. I have many after class chats to address it. Lots of head nodding, but not sure they are hearing it. So ultimately, it's not just words, but body language that matters too. So how do you address that in the bigger picture? Now,
mm,
the reason why we focused on words and harmful language and things that are expressed in this way is that it's a starting point, right? And I think that as a bit of a litmus test for everybody here to consider, if we're as educators not even intervening when we hear racial slurs or homophobic slurs being used, right? That should indicate to us that we're not really at a great place. right? Obviously, much more needs to be done. But even if, for example, the F word or the R word or the N word is not being addressed consistently and seriously and meaningfully, right? That kind of points to a broader issue. So that's one thing that I would say, Pauline, is that it's just a starting point. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other things like students can pass notes, they can draw in appropriate images. I mean, there's really, really quick ways to like share a meme from something online that's super inappropriate or focuses on a person's identity in a negative way. So these things kind of will show themselves in many, many other instances. My suggestion or encouragement around that piece is it's all about the broader environment and culture within the classroom and within the school as well, right? So I would say that sometimes I've had moments in which like a lot has happened in a day, or there were like 4 or 5 or 6 different instances of different students bullying other students. And I was like so overwhelmed and, pretty upset about it and kind of felt like deflated, and we will have those moments. But I would encourage people that, although we have such a high frequency of these incidents happening, that when we really focus and are intentional about that community building, creating an inclusive culture, having all of our colleagues work as a collective to kind of shift that environment within the school, that's where we're going to start to see other issues being addressed and starting to make that impact, not only in terms of language, but also body language and other forms of communication. And then we can go and start to deal with stereotypes and microaggressions and, inappropriate comments, and continuing to go down that road. So when we think about this campaign specifically, and I did share a link in the chat there, if folks wanted to kind of browse through some of the materials that we have there. If a school signs up to the campaign, there's 4 specific commitments that they would make. The first, like we've been talking about this whole time, is active intervention. So we're encouraging everybody to build the skill so everyone in our school community is empowered to speak up when they hear harmful and discriminatory language. Now, that's going to involve all of us as caring adults and staff within the building as the first line of defense, so to say. But of course, we have to involve our students in that process. So that means not only intervening and having our students intervene, but also having the students who are on the receiving end being cared for and being empowered to make those challenges themselves, having students who are witnessing these issues stand up for each other, and even the students who are using that language and who are perpetrating these kinds of incidents. Let's not forget, right? Like these are kids, right? We got to give them more time and space and opportunities to learn and to grow. And so we also have to care and nurture and consider how we work with those students as well to get them to make better decisions. The second piece is committing to staff training. So we actually have tried to make this as easy as we possibly could. We've created a number of different presentation slide decks, including handouts, additional resources, videos, and other content that's available for you that you can pick up and kind of just plug in right into your staff meeting. So we've created like a full-blown 2-hour session if you wanted to commit like a half day. We've broken that down into 2 1-hour sessions if you want to have a whole staff meeting. But I think what's probably more realistic and one of the things that would be easier to pick up is we've put it into 6 mini modules that are about between 15. The first one is about 25 to 30 minutes in length, but the rest of them are about 15 minutes in length. So you can embed them into staff meetings and continue to engage in those conversations. Commitment number 3 would have us working with our parents and caregiver communities. There's this very stereotypical story of, so-and-so student saying something that's way out of line. They get sent down to the administrator's office. It's like, going against school policies. They get a 1 or 2 day suspension at home. And what do, right? They go home. Parents are at work, probably. They zone out on their phone. They're on TikTok for 5 hours or playing video games or goofing around, right? So it's almost like a little mini vacation. And then they come back and nothing really happened, right? So we really want to work alongside of our parents and caregivers to address and to identify and address this at home, as well as having alignment with our practices within the school and to ask how parents and caregivers can get more involved. And finally, we're encouraging folks to have like a little Words Matter Day. As much as we're talking about challenging negative language, we're also encouraging people to engage in affirmations and compliments and spreading love and sharing those positive sentiments with each other. So that's kind of the theme of the Words Matter Day. So, like I said, there's a lot of different materials that we have there: slide decks, resources, handouts, videos, anecdotes, student stories, educator stories, and this is continuing to evolve throughout the year.
It's these four items here that are listed in terms of this pledge. It's interesting for me to look at these and then see alignment to some of the barriers that people identified as to why they might not intervene. Right. So if I feel that my knowledge base or my skill set it might be limited in addressing harmful or discriminatory language, there's an opportunity here for me to develop those skills through the campaign, but not just me individually. I can actually do this with a team of teachers in my staff meetings or in my department meetings or division meetings. And then there's that real full um, wraparound engagement with by engaging then with caregivers, right, and parents and guardians, and then actually being very public about our commitment to this by participating in the Words Matter Day. And that this is really seen as a school community effort. So yeah, I just think that that's it's significant that the to me that the commitments you've noted here and being part of the campaign align with some of the challenges that people have identified in terms of being able to effectively identify and address harmful and discriminatory language.
Yeah, and just to kind of speak to that point of the confidence that we would have to be able to intervene and to share those strategies with our colleagues. Like I have to say that it's a little bit scary, right? Like if you feel like you're gonna say the wrong thing and then all of a sudden that's gonna put you in a bad situation, or now you have some sort of complaint on your file, or you have to go through a process, right? Like that does happen. Unfortunately, it happens to very, very well-meaning educators that might have misspoke or said something that was misunderstood. And so, there are a lot of those concerns or fears. So that's why we're really encouraging to take that whole school approach and to provide as many opportunities as possible for educators to be able to practice it, right? I think obviously, like we tell our students, right? You not only do you have to take those risks, but we learn through making mistakes. So let's go ahead and try that out, right? Let's be open to making a mistake and then getting called out for it. Maybe we'll start off with our colleagues or families or friends or other people, but the more that we practice it, the more we'll have that kind of language and strategies down pat. What I have on the screen here is just kind of like a step-by-step process of how we can meaningfully, comprehensively engage with that. So with this and the materials that you'll be able to access if you signed your school up to the campaign are a number of different little anecdotes and examples of comments and questions that you could ask and things that you could say when the issue does arise. But once again, just kind of demystifying the this aspect, right? Like even though you don't necessarily have to go to school or have a university degree or take in a specific course to know these things. It's useful to do so. And if you have the time, please go ahead and do so. But let's demystify a little bit, right? Like we know, right? You kind of know. You kind of know if something is off in a way. You might not always be sure, and you might not want to jump in with both feet, guns blazing right off the bat. But I think it's really important for us to kind of be sensitive to those pieces that we recognize, right? Like I said, I'm acknowledging that as educators, we all have our existing classroom management strategies. So let's apply those strategies to this specific area as a way of being able to ensure that students feel recognized and heard. I will share one other story about one of the things that's so important from an experience that I had when I was younger, and one of the reasons why I think just being able to work through these pieces as a collective and having people support each other can really make a life-changing impact. So I'm born and raised in the city of Toronto, so I'm very much Canadian, but my family migrated here as refugees from Afghanistan in the late 1980s, fleeing war. That time it was between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. Unfortunately, there's some other actors after that period of time. But anyways, I grew up here, and it's a question that everybody loves to ask each other, like, "Oh, hey, where are you from?" Right?
Mm.
especially if you don't look like, a traditional white Canadian, like, folks always love to ask that question. Even if you do, right? People still like to ask that question. So the response that I would get during my childhood, right? And this is in the 90s, people would ask where you're from, and I would answer, oh, from Afghanistan, and usually people wouldn't even know of that country. They wouldn't know where it was or hadn't heard of it, and so a lot of people would be like, "Huh? Where?" And I'd be like, "Oh, it's between Iran and Pakistan," and especially the kids, like they'd be like, "Ah, what?" I'd be like, "It's in Asia. It's like close to India, like it's in that area." So that was kind of the
Mm.
response that I would get, right? A little bit of a typical kind of interaction of the question, where are you from? Now, when I was in just starting out middle school, now I'm showing my age to everybody here. 9/11 happened, and so as an 11-year-old child, right, I saw a huge shift in my life so immediately, so drastically, of that question now being asked again. And instead of, getting that response, now all of a sudden Afghanistan is very much in the spotlight. And so people would react. Uh, Students, classmates of mine, would make fun of it, right? Like, oh, ha ha ha, you're a Taliban, your dad's Osama bin Laden, oh, you're a terrorist, right? And this type of language started to pop up. One of the unfortunate things that I remember from that time period as well, like, I think I'm 11 or 12 or 13 years old, and people are asking me, adults are asking me, where are you from? And I say Afghanistan, and like their eyes would pop out of their head,
Yeah.
and like,
Yeah.
what did you want me to do with that? Like, okay, so you're so shocked that this child is from Afghanistan. Anyway, so that started off a process of years of Islamophobic language and that type of Islamophobic bullying being directed toward me.
Mm.
The word being called a terrorist was something that I had to go through like for so long, right? And I know that
Mm.
some of us on this call might relate to that specifically, or I mean, there might be another type of category of your identity that was focused on, right? But just think about like, what you're going through as a kid who all of a sudden is like under this magnifying glass, right? And while I'm being called a terrorist at school, I go home and then I watch the news and I see live broadcasts on CNN of bombs being dropped on Afghanistan, and people
Mm.
who like I have some form of connection with. It's like my cultural background, it's like my nationality, are being killed live on TV, right? And of course, the Canadian military is involved in the efforts broadly. So this is the kind of dynamic that I'm experiencing, right? And a couple years after that, war in Afghanistan started. Of course, the invasion and war in Iraq began, and that was another very significant moment for me. I became very, very politicized at a young age as a result of these specific experiences that I'm sharing with you all right now. And even though I knew I was very bothered by it, every time, I'd be made fun of because I'm Middle Eastern, because of where I'm from, I would say something, right? I would tell my classmates like, F off in some other way, right? Like, like I'd
Sure.
dish it
Sure.
back to
Yeah.
them in a way like, like you can't mess with me too much, but it still persisted for a very, very long period of time. Now, this continued into high school, and so this is years and years and years of this, right? And these are people who I would even identify as friends and good buddies of mine, classes that I had for several years, and this would continue. I would say I don't like it, cut it out, it would continue. And then eventually you kind of get beat down over time, right? Or you might kind of laugh along with it or just be like, ah, shut up and just like keep going along. Now, that trend continued. And this story, I'll end it with this last piece here. So I won a couple baseball tickets, tickets to the Blue Jays game downtown Toronto. And I knew my one friend, and it doesn't really matter too much, but just for like detail's sake, his background, he's Punjabi, he's Sikh himself. Um, he really loved the Blue Jays. So I said, okay, I know who to take to the game. So I took my friend. We went downtown together on the transit and watched the game. Great seats. He almost caught a ball. It was like a couple centimeters away. Anyway, so his older sister, who was probably like 4 or 5 years older than us, and we were in grade 11, I think, at the time, um, came to pick us up, and we're driving back home in the west end of the city. And me and my friend were talking, we're chatting, and he like once again like supposedly jokingly says, "Oh, yada yada yada, you're a terrorist, right?" And it was as if like, she didn't actually do it, but it was as if his older sister like had slammed the brakes on the car at that point in time, because as soon as she heard her younger brother saying that to me, she immediately spun around and, in a very, very serious tone with like a raised voice, asked her brother, "What did you just say to him?
Mm,
Did I just hear that correctly?"
mm,
And my friend, her brother, responds like, "Oh, we're just joking around. It's okay." So she asks me like, "Is that okay with you?" And I say,
mm,
"You know what? I'm used to it, but I don't like it. No, I don't really want him to say that, but just kind of something that they say like you should." So she continues and says to her brother, "You should not use that. Like, look at this person. Like, this is your friend that you're calling this term, right? Like somebody who just actually took you out to have fun and took you to a baseball game, and now you're calling him a terrorist, right? Is that how you think you should treat your friends?" And she turns to me and asks me again, right? Like, is that what you want your friends to say to you? And I say, absolutely not. I don't want that. And actually, I would prefer that to stop. And so she goes back to her brother and scolds him and tells him, like, "I don't ever want to hear you saying that again. I never want to hear that any other time."
mm.
So then we continue, right? And we still had a ways to get back home, but obviously it's a bit tense in the back seat there that we're sitting in. But I'm thinking about it, and I'm meditating on what she said, and it really impacted me, Moses. And the reason why
Yeah.
it had such a huge impact is because I realized in that moment that no other adult had done that for me for
Mm,
5, 6, or almost 7 years at that point. So for
wow.
6 years, no other adult had
Mm,
actually intervened in that very sincere and serious way. So when we got home, and this is back in the days of MSN Messenger, right? Like, we were kept chatting, me and my friend, and he's kind of apologizing, but also being like, "Oh, I didn't know," right? And I'm like, "No, I told you over and over again. You did know, right? I told you." And I told him with like the same level of seriousness that his sister was talking to him, that I don't want to
mm,
hear again. Right. And I'm like really putting my foot down on this. And not
mm,
only with you, but you better tell everybody else that you usually make these jokes with, that I will not accept it anymore. And I'm gonna
mm,
respond in a way that you guys
mm,
like, right? Um, and it immediately changed the environment back at school. Then it was like people were like tense about it for like a couple days, and then
mm,
it just shifted. And I just think back to that story regularly of how important that intervention was for me, right? Like, even though I was political, I thought a lot about like, racial justice and all these other political issues and international conflicts. And I felt I was pretty well spoken at that age as well. I would say something and intervene, but like having an adult that actually cared and intervened and supported me in that moment gave me
mhm,
this extra sense of being able to feel empowered to really put an end to that language being used toward me. And I just really wanted to share that story with everybody here on this call today, just to think about, the impact that we can have, right? This was half my life ago that I'm sharing the story with you, but even as I'm sharing it right now, it's impacting me emotionally just to think about how
mm,
significant that intervention was. So
yeah.
obviously it took energy and consideration and seriousness from my friend's sister to intervene in that way. But think about it, it was just about 3 to 5 minutes or so of her saying something that altered my life. So when we think about
Yeah.
how we can make these changes happen within our school communities, I wanted to share that story as a reminder of the deep impacts that we can have with all of our students. And in that story, I wasn't the only one that was affected, right? My friend who was using that language was also affected and
Right.
encouraged to make better decisions. So that's really the kind of spirit and the energy behind the Words Matter campaign. And I'm really
Mm,
hopeful to see that once we have all of our colleagues working together in unison as a collective, right? I really
mm,
am excited to see that those impacts will be felt in with students all across the province.
mhm. Shavik, thank you so much for sharing that deeply personal story. Um, the work of reculturalizing our schools is a very is very deep and actually personal work. And I don't know that we often uh, I don't know how aware we are of that. What I'm thinking about is one of the comments that you had made earlier, it was around demystifying, right? And just trying it, and that being ready to commit ourselves to um standing up and doing this, and it might not, kind of anticipating that we're going to have to learn to get good at this, and the way you learn is for mistakes to happen. But it's worth it because of and you're a testament to this. It's worth it because it's going to matter to our students in a profoundly lifelong way. And so the trepidation that we may feel in engaging in this kind of work, and our concerns about not doing it right, um, when you kind of commit to it, you are going to be changed personally, and yeah, like, to just commit to it and get as many people as you can engaged in the conversation. I think it's, yeah, I really, it's exciting to know um that it is possible, and to be reminded of the value of this kind of work, that you can make such a profound, again, lifelong impact. So thanks for that. Thanks for that. I really I appreciate it. I'm sure I'm seeing a couple comments come through the chat. There's a great appreciation for sharing that story. So with that, everyone, I want to thank you for attending this webinar. I hope that you were able to glean some important insights into how this work can look. Shafiq, do you want to speak to the information you've just put on the screen here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just sharing some info. If folks wanted to get in touch with us as an organization, find out more about the campaign, get signed up, like, please let us know. Campaign website is there. I've shared it in the chat as well, but you can scan it as a QR code. I'll add the URL again. I'm going to share my personal email here in the chat. If folks wanted
Great.
to get in touch with me, would be very, very happy to connect. Now the campaign is going to be taking part this school year, but the resources will be available in the future. And even if you don't sign up for the campaign, I mean, I'd love to just hear the experiences that you're going through within your schools. If there's any way that we can support at Harmony Movement, we're really, really intentional on building our networks and creating those points of communication with as many educators as possible. So I'm sincerely asking folks, if they'd like to get in touch, please feel free to send me an email at sses@harmony.ca. If you want to find out about the campaign, info@harmony.ca is the email you can send it to, or just register on our website. But Moses, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be able to connect with all these wonderful folks here on our call this evening. And yeah, I'm really, really looking forward to seeing how this campaign rolls out throughout this school year, and hopefully having more of those impactful moments for as many students as we can.